Hi everyone, and welcome to Chelmsford Bible Church, our virtual service. And we hope that everybody's doing well. We hope that everybody's hanging in there during this COVID crisis. And again, let us know if you need anything. Let us know how we can be of service to you, even at a distance. We're going to continue with our series that we started a couple weeks ago called Hope Now. And hope is definitely something that we need right now. And I don't know about you, but I'm always watching the news. I'm always checking the news, always checking the latest stats to see if there's any glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to get back to normal or whatever normal is soon. You know, there's some people that think they're too far gone to experience the love and grace of Jesus. They hesitate to come to church because they feel like the walls are going to cave in around them. They're too far gone. They've done too much stuff in their life. They've made too many mistakes and poor choices that there is no way God would redeem them, and there's no way that God would love them. You know, I felt that way at one point in my life. I struggled for the longest time with pornography. The guilt and shame I experienced due to my poor choices was overwhelming at times. There were times when I thought I would just end it. I'm done. I would never overcome the struggle. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. There was no hope that I would ever be over this. You know, there was even a period of time when I would cut myself because I thought, you know, that's the punishment I deserve for my sins and my poor choices. But then Jesus intervened and Jesus reminded me of who I am in Him. Jesus broke through that guilt and shame and restored my soul, as the psalmist says, as David says. The great part of Jesus' intervention in my life was that He didn't expect me to come up to where He was. He met me where I was. He met me in the filth of my sin. He met me in the midst of my guilt and reminded me over and over what He did for me on the cross. He reminded me over and over that there was no condemnation for me because I was found in Him. See, Jesus didn't expect and never expects us to clean ourselves up before we come to Him. He doesn't expect us to be perfectly finished products when He calls us. None of Jesus' disciples were finished products when He called them. Peter was a guy who didn't always think before he spoke. Nathanael didn't think anything good could come from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Judas was a thief, while James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven on those who opposed them. The one disciple that we're going to look at today is Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector when Jesus called him to follow Him. And Matthew was a guy who was despised, rejected. Nobody liked him. And what can we learn today from the calling of Matthew? And what immediately followed after that calling? And what message does this story have for us today as followers of Jesus? So the first thing we're going to look at is this idea of hope's calling. In Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 28, this is the story that Luke records of Matthew's calling. And this is what Luke writes. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Levi was Matthew's Hebrew name. Matthew was his Greek name. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." And Levi got up, left everything, and followed Him. Now my first question is, after reading this, why does Matthew immediately leave everything and follow this Jesus? It almost seems like this is the first time he had any interaction with Jesus. You know, let me give you a little context of tax collectors during the first century Israel. Levi was considered a traitor to his people because a tax collector was a Jew who worked for the Romans. And the Jewish people, they tolerated the Romans, but they didn't like the Romans. The Romans allowed the Jews to have some freedoms as long as those freedoms did not intrude upon Roman law. The Romans would hire Jewish people to be tax collectors in Israel, but this did not sit well with the Jewish people. There was a time where the religious leaders asked Jesus, "Is it right for us to pay taxes?" And Jesus said, "Well, give me a coin. Let me see that. Whose image is on it?" And they said, "Well, Caesar's." And Jesus said, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God's what is God's." And the reason that Jesus said that, the reason that story is significant to what we're talking about with Levi, is that the Jewish people were required to pay taxes to the Roman government. The Roman coin has the image of Caesar inscribed on it. And to the Jews, paying taxes to Caesar could be considered blasphemous, considering Caesar was king, and paying taxes to him would recognize him as a king. And to the Jewish people, there was only one king, and that was God. Levi would not have a lot of friends, if he had any at all. He would have been wealthy because tax collectors not only collected their required Roman tax, but they added some interest on top of that. And that interest they would keep for themselves, and that's how they became wealthy. But the thing is, Levi probably lived a very lonely life. His only friends would be other tax collectors and sinners, and who knows how many of those were even actually his friends. Levi probably heard about Jesus walking around healing and teaching. Perhaps he was curious about this new rabbi. Maybe he even thought about following him. Maybe he even thought, hey, why am I living this life alone when I could be following this new rabbi who everyone is talking about? But then maybe Matthew or Levi thought, you know what? I don't know if I'm worthy enough to follow him. You see, Levi was probably a man who didn't have a lot of hope. He had a lot of money and comfort for a Jew living under the Roman Empire in the first century. But the ancient historian Philo described tax collectors like this. He described them as particularly brutal. According to Philo, Rome would hire people who had an insatiable greed and would stop at nothing to collect money. Philo recorded that tax collectors would even collect taxes from the dead or the dying. We don't know if Levi was like this, but we can assume that maybe he was. Maybe he had tendencies like this. Levi was probably ruthless in his profession. And maybe that's why that he would think, maybe I'm not worthy to follow this Jesus guy. Maybe he was wrestling with that internally. But then Jesus entered Levi's life. And Jesus offered him hope. He offered hope to a man who probably lived without much hope at all. And let's assume that Levi was a little ruthless at his job and didn't show a lot of mercy to his clients. Deep down, Levi probably still wanted people around him who loved him. His parents may not have even wanted to have anything to do with him. But Levi was a human being. And like all human beings, he needed companionship. We're all feeling that right now. We need that companionship. This isolation is a little hard for us because we need human interaction and companionship. But then Jesus entered Matthew's life. And Jesus offered him not only companionship, he offered Levi hope. Jesus called Levi to a life of hope that would be defined by hope. In Isaiah chapter 43, verse 1, the prophet Isaiah, he writes about something about hope. And I think that perhaps, and this may be assuming on my part, but maybe Matthew thought about this verse when Jesus called him. Because this is what Isaiah says. But now, this is what the Lord says. He who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. Maybe Matthew, when Jesus called him and said, follow me, maybe Matthew thought of a verse in Isaiah. And he thought, God does have redemption for me. This rabbi, who some are saying is the Messiah, the one sent from God, perhaps maybe even the Son of God, has redemption for me because he has called me by my name. And then look at Isaiah chapter 43, verse 10. In the same chapter, the same prophet, he says this, you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me no God was formed, nor will there be one after me. See, Jesus, he's calling us, and he called Matthew to this life of hope. No matter where we are in life, he calls us to follow him. Whenever you're going out to meet someone, you usually put yourself together. You take a shower, put on some clothes. Ladies, you put on makeup, do your hair. Guys, we do our hair too. But then imagine if you're going to meet the Queen of England or the President of the United States. How would you prepare yourself then? You'd probably go shopping to find something way nicer than anything you own. You would take extra time to make sure you looked absolutely perfect. You might even take 2 showers just to make sure. And we do that because the office that the person holds dictates how we prepare ourselves to meet them. There are certain unspoken expectations that go along with that type of meeting. But with Jesus, the God who created all things and the great I am, he meets us wherever we are, even if we haven't showered yet. He doesn't care what we're rolling in. He doesn't care what we look like, what we smell like. He doesn't care. He just wants us to come to him and follow him. He calls out to us with a message of hope to change our lives from hopeless to overflowing with hope. I remember when I was growing up, my dad, if I was going to go to an interview, my dad would always say, hey, make sure you shower, make sure you shave, make sure you put on nice clothes, look presentable, iron your shirt, all those kind of things. And that was good advice. But sometimes we associate that kind of advice with God too, and God doesn't care about that stuff. He even says in his word that man cares about the outside, but God looks at the heart. And Jesus saw something in Matthew, and Jesus wanted to give Matthew hope. And Jesus wants to give people hope today as well. What kind of hope is he going to give us? Well, he's going to give us this hope in the dirt. That's the second thing we're going to look at, is hope in the dirt. In Luke 5, 29 through 31. This is continuing the story of Matthew as recorded by Luke. And this is what Luke writes, starting in verse 29, picking up right where we left off. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." You see, the religious leaders, they detested tax collectors. They saw tax collectors as beneath them. They wouldn't even go into a tax collector's house because they would be unclean. They even thought tax collectors were unclean. Therefore, they wouldn't even let them come and worship at the temple. So when Jesus went to Levi's house, the religious leaders did not approve. In fact, this act put a blemish on Jesus' ministry in the eyes of these religious leaders. They thought for sure that any respectable rabbi would never darken the door of a tax collector, much less eat with him. You see, the religious leaders saw Jesus as someone who was playing in the dirt, and that should be beneath him if he was supposed to be any sort of respectable teacher. But Jesus had another view. Jesus rebuked those religious leaders for their views. He actually rebuked them when he said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. Because he was looking at them saying, you guys think you're healthy. So therefore you probably think you don't need a doctor. But these people I'm eating with, they know they're sick and they know they need a doctor. Jesus still does this work today. He still gets his hands dirty with us so that we could be made clean by him. You see, Jesus doesn't hand us a bottle of soap or a bottle of hand sanitizer and say, make sure you wash off really good. I don't like to get dirty. No, Jesus makes us clean. Jesus is willing to touch us even in our filth to make us clean. You see, the Jewish people were tired of the righteous requirements imposed on them by the religious leaders. Those requirements could not be lived up to, and it was exhausting. And Jesus came and challenged all of that. And he changed all of that. He called people to a life that was defined by Jesus, not what people could or could not do. You see, people still do not need more religious rules to follow. They just want freedom. That's what they need. We need freedom. And Jesus offers freedom. Have we ever thought that maybe the reason some people don't go to church is because they don't feel worthy? They don't want to walk into our communities and our church families because they feel like they're going to be judged. As followers of Jesus, we're called to be witnesses of the freedom that Jesus offers, of the hope that Jesus offers. We're to be witnesses to the God who got dirty for us. We're called to be messengers of good news. It's the good news that meets us where we are and changes us where we are. It's the good news that called the prodigal son home. And the prodigal son walking home, limping home, telling himself, you know what, I'm just going to be a slave, a servant in my father's house. I'm not going to be a son anymore because I'm not worthy to be a son. And it's the good news of the Father that runs to the Son and embraces the Son in his filth, in his dirt. And he puts a robe on him and puts rings on his fingers, and he tells his servants, you go throw a party because my son has returned. And we're going to celebrate that. You see, the gospel of Jesus tells us that there is a God who will run to us if we turn to him. And not turn to him perfect, not turn to him all fixed up by our own efforts. It's turning to him almost limping. We can barely walk. We can't even pick our eyes up off the ground. We can't even, the weight of the world's on our shoulders and it's weighing us down. We can barely walk. Sometimes we have to even crawl, and sometimes we can't even do that. And the gospel tells us there's a God who will run to us and embrace us wherever we're at, whether we're standing, limping, crawling, or laying flat on the ground. He'll wrap his arms around us and give us hope. And that is the hope that Jesus brought with him, and the hope that he paid for with his death on the cross, and the hope that he secured when he walked out of the tomb alive. So in closing, hope is calling. Hope is calling everybody today. Everyone who's alive today, hope is calling. Everybody's going to be alive tomorrow. Hope is calling. And that hope is calling us in our dirt, in our filth, in our grime, to say there is life, there is new life, there is changed life, only in Jesus. And that's the gospel. That's what the gospel is all about. That's the gospel that wraps its arms around us and says, there is change. You can have a new life, not by your own efforts, but because of Jesus. And let us hope in that. Amen.